Educational choice. It's a wonderful virtue that a number of states have adopted to enable parents to have their kids go to the school that they want their child to go to be able to afford to do that, possibly even a Christian school. Well, right now, Pacific Justice Institute is involved in a case out of the state of Montana that could have a big determining factor in whether or not parents will have that opportunity and that right, not just in Montana, but potentially in other states as well. It's a very important case. We're going to talk about that in the second part of this show. But the first part of the show, I want to talk to someone from the Family Research Council about a pending legislation before the United States Congress. Now, I usually don't talk about legislation that much, unless it's very important. Folks, this legislation is extremely, extremely important. This is legislation that will impact religious freedom adversely in a very decisive, very strong way. It's something that'll infringe upon parents' rights. It's something that'll infringe upon principles of justice and fairness. And it has already passed the U.S. House. And because of this urgency, because of where we're at, I wanted to make sure that we focused on that in the first part of the show, and I know you'll be very appreciative when you hear what we're going to talk about. And to help us enlighten ourselves about this, I'll have with us on the show from the Family Research Council, Mary Beth Waddell. Beth, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're talking here about the Equality Act, which first off is a misnomer because I call it the Anti-Religious Freedom Parental Rights Act. That's really what they should call it. The Anti-Justice, Anti-Equality Act is what they should call it. But it's called the Equality Act, and it does a number of terrible things. And one of the things I want to address that it's reportedly going to do is that it would penalize Americans who don't affirm new sexual norms or gender identity, including people perhaps who have like the Masterpiece Cake Shop. Phillips was the owner, didn't want to make a cake for a gay wedding. He gets sued. This could actually turn that kind of a case on its head and require business owners to have to compromise their faith when it comes to deeply held religious beliefs regarding sexuality, sexual lifestyles, correct?
Absolutely. You do have those individuals who are business owners who would no longer be able to portray the identity that they want for their company and be able to hire according to their religious convictions, even though Jack Phillips would serve anyone, as Barronelle Stutzman, as the Kleins, all of these other cases that you've heard, they serve individuals. There are just certain things and certain acts that they don't want to do and don't want to participate in, and you could see a very different outcome in their cases if the Equality Act had passed before Masterpiece went to the court.
So if this passes, if you're a Christian business owner out there, there's a good chance this is going to impact you and force you to have to choose between living your faith or giving up your business or having it or being sued and having it taken away. That alone is strong enough for me to say why people should come out against this. And yet it also would impair speech. It would actually compel people to say things that violate their faith, not just to be silent, but actually to have to say things that violate their faith. And there's a case in dealing with a Virginia high school teacher, Peter Vlaming. He lost his job because he refused to refer to a student with the wrong pronoun. So the student changes their gender, and he refuses to use the other pronoun instead of he, say she, or vice versa, because he knows that's a lie. He's not going to affirm a lie. And so instead he says, I'll use the first name. Well, that's ongoing case matter. This legislation would be a slam dunk defeat for this teacher and teachers like him who would be effectively purged from public schools across the country or have to compromise their faith. Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's actually not the only teacher. There's another teacher the French teacher that I just have heard about that also had this issue with using proper pronouns and potentially being fired for that as well. That you do you're seeing play out what the fear of the dissenters in Obergefell was. In his opinion, in Obergefell, Justice Kennedy said, that reasonable, sincere people hold these traditional beliefs and have held them for centuries, and that's okay, that there's nothing's going to happen to them, that they're sincere people. And yet you had a number of dissents say, no, this opinion and this ideology is going to be used to actually vilify those and go after those who hold traditional views.
Right. Christians.
And that's exactly what you're seeing.
Yeah, Christians, Orthodox Jewish people, people with traditional religious beliefs who believe what the Bible says, they're going to be sitting targets if this passes. But they're not alone. I understand this is also going to impact religious charities like adoption agencies, Catholic charities where they're trying to have help kids have families, wonderful, loving families for adoption or foster care. They effectively could be shut down as well unless they're forced to compromise their deeply held convictions of not wanting to place a child in a home where it's a gay couple or a transgender couple or engaging in a lifestyle that clearly violates what their faith teaches is best for the children that they're trying to help. They would shut them down across the country. This is not just a trajectory. This is very real. We've seen this actually in a number of places, like in Philadelphia. How serious of a concern do you think this should be for people who have ministries that are going to be literally shut down by this intolerant legislation via this quote-unquote Equality Act?
I think this is a big concern, not only in the Equality Act space, but in a number of spaces. There's been particular focus and particular attack on faith-based adoption and foster care agencies. As you've mentioned, there's a number of states and localities that have shut them down to the detriment of tens of thousands of children. In Illinois alone, I believe it was about 2,500 children were displaced because Catholic Charities was shut down. And in Philadelphia, you've had foster parents of the year's homes who were empty despite Philadelphia's urgent call for needing homes. And
Wow.
So you're seeing this attack on traditional views is actually hurting some of the most needy children in our country.
Yes, it's hurting the children. They're needy. Ministries will be shut down, will not be able to serve them if this becomes law. This is not just a trajectory. This is looking at the language. It is going to trounce religious freedom of individuals, institutions, but it's also going to affect those who are in athletic competition. I think this is really preposterous in that it's going to allow more biological males to compete against females, which is going to turn the Civil Rights Act on its head by allowing males to dominate female sports. And we already see this taking place. This act is just going to institutionalize this across the country. I find that to be very disturbing. And if I had a daughter competing in athletics, I wouldn't want some guy to be able to come in and take her scholarship opportunity, to take her opportunity to play on a team and have her booted off because some guy who has gender identity dysphoria takes the place. Now, I want to say this, Mary Beth, in all fairness, are there kids out there who have this mental condition, gender identity dysphoria? Yes, they need love, they need compassion, they need understanding. But this legislation would allow them to engage in a serious injustice on others who do not have the same medical, biological advantage. I find that very objectionable. It's also going to affect medical professionals. How is it going to affect medical professionals? Tell me more. Absolutely.
So one of the changes that the Equality Act makes is to public accommodations within the Civil Rights Act. And so it would now add the medical profession as a public accommodation and put a non-discrimination requirement as it relates to sexual orientation and gender identity, which means that doctors would no longer really be able to use their medical judgment when making decisions about the proper care for individuals who identify as LGBT, that the only care that they're allowed to give is quote-unquote affirmative care that has actually been shown to be very harmful and not helpful. And it would really tie the hands of that medical community and force them to provide procedures that they fundamentally disagree with, both on a moral level and believe as a doctor is not medically good procedure for their patient.
Emotionally, mentally, there's still the same depression, same suicide rate for those who have the procedure versus those that don't. It has no biological need whatsoever. There's no medical condition. I tell you, Mary Beth, this is terrible because it just trounces on medical professionalism. And then to force a physician to have to cut off body parts, literally, to give injections, literally, when they know as a matter of medical ethics, this is not in the best procedures of the person, much less maybe violates their own faith and convictions to engage in this kind of masochistic practice in their view. So this is also, I think, very disturbing as well. Now, what about parents losing custody of their children? We at Pacific Justice Institute are big advocates of defending the rights of parents. We know that children have been taken wrongfully before because of the alleged sexual orientation expressed by the child or their child's desire to want to change their gender. This is going to impact this on a nationwide level to enable parents to lose their children. Explain how.
This bill, it sort of normalizes this idea of sexual orientation and gender identity and the fact that, you are born that way, and so that, and it's discriminatory to believe differently. So if there is a parent who believes, no, my daughter is my daughter, my son is my son, and if that is seen as discriminatory and bigoted, and you have the medical community's hands tied, that's going to absolutely bleed over into you're not doing what is best for this child. Like the medical community is saying this is what's best, and you're disagreeing with it, so we need to take your child for their own interest.
Yeah, it is outrageous. Folks, if this passes, you could lose your child anywhere in the country because you don't want to allow your child to change their gender, or you don't salute your child as their decision to engage in same-sex sexual activities. That is what we're talking about. It also would enable sexual assault, potentially. We really don't have time to get into that. But if you've been listening to this program, you should be aware that this is very dangerous. This has already passed the House, and it's, it could pass the U.S. Senate, particularly depending on what happens in the next election. It could be signed by the President of the United States, depending on what happens in the next election. Find out how your congressman voted on this in the House of Representatives, folks, and decide if you want that, if that represents you and what you think is best for your children, for your church, for your ministry, for your job, for your family, for the United States of America. Mary Beth, thank you once again for being on this show. God bless you and keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me. You as well.
And folks, if you want to learn more about this, go to our website, pji.org. We'll have an article stating in depth what exactly this is doing and the harm that this could play on your family, on your community, and on your country.
If parents knew what was happening, I think they'd be very, very alarmed.
It's not about procreation. They're learning about lifestyles, sexual activities.
This stuff is XXX rated.
And we say no to that.
You're giving girls very high doses of testosterone, and it's going to harm them.
California law requires that school districts actually put a positive spin on the HIV crisis.
This is about sexual roles together, boys, and boys, girls and girls.
You can't teach this in an unbiased way. It's a moral topic.
A lot of graphic information that was confusing.
Tells little boys it's perfectly normal to masturbate with other little boys because everyone does it.
Choose their gender.
The role playing in the class.
That's our children.
So what do?
We need all of you to rise up to fight for kids.
If you'd like to support the work of the Pacific Justice Institute, it'd be greatly appreciated. Just go to our website, pji.org. Your support is completely tax deductible. And we also have some great resources there on our website, including wonderful materials dealing with protecting your kids in public schools. We have an opt-out form. It's very helpful, very informative. I strongly encourage you to check it out. Go to pji.org, and there you can also sign up to get our regular updates, our weekly updates on cases that you're not going to hear about in regular mainstream media, but you nonetheless are very, very important if you appreciate religious freedom, parental rights, the sanctity of human life, and basic civil liberties like those. So go to our website, pji.org. Now, we have with us here on the line Kevin Snyder, who's the chief counsel of the Pacific Justice Institute, to talk about a very important case that has gone up to the United States Supreme Court that we are participating in, dealing with a private school under attack in all states. Montana? Kevin, is that right, Montana?
That's correct, Brad.
Yeah, I just would have expected Oregon, Washington, California, New York, Illinois. But when people think of Montana, they usually think like, it's a pretty reasonable, level-headed state. They're not supposed to be hostile to private schools of faith, Christian schools, and yet that's exactly what we're dealing with here is a state picking on a private Christian school. Tell us more.
Well, in 2015, Brad, the state legislature passed the Montana Tax Credit Scholarship Program, which allows Montanans to get a tax credit of $150 of their contributions to a privately run scholarship program. And now these tax donors donate to a student scholarship program generally. They don't direct the money specifically to a parent or a student or a specific private school. So parents apply for a scholarship to the student scholarship programs, and these independent nonprofits review and approve these applications, and they either grant a scholarship to a student or they don't. Now, the Montana Department of Revenue refused to implement the program, citing the state's constitution and claiming that it aided sectarian schools. So instead of doing what the legislature told it to do, the department created its own rule that limits the use of scholarship funds only to children that attend non-religious private schools. Two low-income parents whose children attended a religious-affiliated private school brought a lawsuit.
Okay, so let me see if I get this right. So Montana says, okay, we'll have vouchers. Parents can be able to have their kids go to the school of their choice. Fantastic. That's great. But if it's to a religious school, then we're not going to let you use those vouchers to go to a religious private school, only secular schools or secular private schools. So they're overtly discriminating against parents' right to be able to have their child actually go to the school of their choice if it's a religious school?
Well, yeah, the taxpayers give to a third-party scholarship program, and they don't designate it for a specific school. It's just a general scholarship program, but the money they won't allow to be used for a religious school, just a secular school.
Yeah, that is outrageous. I mean, we'd like to say we're in a free society. Government is supposed to be neutral, not hostile to religion. And yet, this to me looks like clear hostility to religion. How did this fan out in the courts in Montana?
Well, in the trial courts, the trial court ruled for the parents, and I believe correctly. It found that the money goes from the taxpayer to these private third-party scholarship programs. The money was never in the treasury of the state of Montana. Unfortunately, the Montana Supreme Court reversed and found that they just reached out and said that the program aids religion in violation of the state's constitution.
Well, a charitable donation to a church, tax-deductible charitable donation to a church, aids religion. And so I have a real problem with this because, as you pointed out, the fact is this money that taxpayers decide to divert to this scholarship program. It doesn't go to the government. It goes to a third party, and that third party then distributes it. So everything would have been fine if the government had just stayed out of it. But because the Montana Department of Revenue decides to issue their own rules on this to be oppressive and discriminatory against parents who want to have their kids go to a private religious school instead of just, say, a private secular school, that's the creation of the problem. Now, this case hasn't stopped at the state Supreme Court of Montana. My understanding is that it's actually has now actually gone to the United States Supreme Court. Tell us more.
It's gone to the United States Supreme Court, and the High Court has granted the petition for review, which is, of course, as you know, quite rare. And so the court sees something in the Montana Supreme Court that is raising some eyebrows.
Yeah, that's a really good sign, folks. If you're listening to this and wondering, well, is that good that the Supreme Court took it up or not? That's really good because of the fact that there was an adverse decision at the state Supreme Court level. The fact that the United States Supreme Court is taking this up, that's a good sign that the justices there, and particularly the Chief Justice, Roberts, believes that this needs to be examined and possibly overruled. So this is a very good step in the right direction. Now, we at Pacific Justice Institute have played a role in this. We filed an amicus brief on this case. What did we argue in this amicus brief, friend of the court brief?
Well, we hit them right in the gut on this. We take aim directly at the fundamental assumption of the Montana Supreme Court. The Montana Supreme Court has a misguided notion that all money belongs to the government. So if you donate to a charity, like you said, to a church and deduct that from your tax bill, the Supreme Court says, the Montana Supreme Court says, you've taken money out of the Treasury. And so they're saying every donation you make, every exemption is a government subsidy. We think that's extremely dangerous presupposition.
Yes, I know when I give to my church, I don't think that I'm giving to the government to help the work of the government, to subsidize the government. No, I'm giving to my church according to my faith and beliefs. So for them to think that somehow, because there's a tax benefit, that inherently that money is somehow tagged as their money, I think is ridiculous. And I think there's a really good chance the Supreme Court's going to see that. So, Kevin, what we're talking about here is something that potentially could be much broader than just dealing just with private religious schools getting the shaft and parents getting the shaft of being able to have their kids benefit from third-party scholarship programs. We're talking about a whole philosophy being argued here, basically empowering the government to have controls on institutions that are private religious institutions that receive charitable donations, tax-deductible charitable donations from private individuals. That seems to be very dangerous.
It's very dangerous, and it's very broad, Brad. And we don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but the fundamental problem rests in the Montana's Constitution, in which 38 states in all have the same type of language, and that prevents, they say, any direct or indirect aid to sectarian organizations, violates their religion clauses. But again, it could be taken to such an extreme that when the taxpayer writes a check, that they're deeming the government to have subsidized the religion. So it's a very, very dangerous precedent if this holds.
Yeah, there's similar language to that which you just mentioned, the Bain Amendment, was cited in another case where in the state of Missouri, there was an attempt to discriminate against a religious institution's playground from receiving safety materials to make it a safe place for kids to play. And they were denied because the argument was, well, hey, this is a religious affiliated institution. The playground is affiliated with the church. So we're not going to protect those kids, even though there was clear objective qualification for them to receive that funding, because they said we have the Bain Amendment, which allows no money to go to any institution that in any way is religious in any aspect thereof, even if it's for a valid secular purpose. I think that this Supreme Court, Kevin, and I may be wrong, I think this Supreme Court is ready to obliterate the Bain Amendment as we've had it applied in so many states to prevent states from in the future engaging in clear, blatant hostility and discrimination against religious institutions, whether they're private schools or other programs that are benefiting people, have a valid secular purpose, and yet are being treated like second-class citizens simply because they have faith or they're religious. I think it's high time to see this happen. I'm happy that the President of the United States has appointed some members on the court that I think will see this correctly, reasonably, and protect religious freedom and the ability for institutions not to be shortchanged through such amendments like the Bain Amendment. So, Kevin, this is an important case. I salute the work you're doing on it, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So, folks, there you have it. It's our God-given freedoms we're talking about. Now, let's choose to keep them. I'm Brian Dacus, president of the Pacific Justice Institute. Have a great weekend.